Before we begin, in 2019, YouTube was caught data mining children under the age of 13, violating the Child's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. Since settling, YouTube has enacted new policies meant to dodge responsibility and scapegoat creators. This video is not made for kids. It is not targeted at kids. It is not advertising to kids. Parental discretion is advised. Hey guys, how's everyone doing? This is the Sentinel watching over Geekdom, and welcome back to Sentinel Reviews. And a very happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Today, I thought I'd do something special. And by something special, I mean review something sort of in theme with the holiday. So today, we will be looking at Dark Shadows, Maggie and Quentin, The Lover's Refrain. Released in June of 2018 from Big Finish Productions, and directed by Alan Flanagan, David Darlington, and Joseph Lidster. Maggie and Quentin, The Lover's Refrain stars Catherine Lee Scott as Maggie Evans and David Selby as Quentin Collins. As always, there is a blanket spoiler warning in place. I will be discussing spoilers, and as you know, I do these unscripted, so yeah, this is your only warning if you have not heard the property yet. And this set, as most of the box sets from Big Finish do, consists of 4 stories. Let me look at it, because these are some big names, and these are writers, and none of which I've memorized. So, we have The Girl Beneath the Water by Lila Whelan, The Sand That Speaks His Name by Mark Thomas Passmore, The Hollow Winds That Beckon by Cody Shell, and The Paper to the Flame by Alan Flanagan. And I'm going to try and do this review a little differently. You know, normally when I do my box set reviews, I do separate segments edited together for each story. But I'm going to try and do this one differently because, well, mainly because there's no individual covers. So, yeah, let's just jump right into this by starting with The Girl in the Water. And this story is set several years after the series. Maggie and Quentin have gotten together with their children, Emily, I think is her name, I'm forgetting the daughter's name, and Ronan, to celebrate Quentin's 65th birthday. But something's not right. And Maggie begins putting together that there are, obviously, as always, dark forces at work. You know, and this story is really good, actually, at setting up what's going on. Just specifically for this story. The greater story at hand in this set, this one doesn't really lead into, but let me start over. Dark Shadows, and horror in general, in my opinion, works best when it's atmospheric, you know. The horror, the scares come at the best when you know how to set the atmosphere, you know. Unease permeates every scene you're in. There's just a great tension hanging in the air. And that's what The Girl in the Water does so well. You know, it's just like after the initial setup of the story, as it goes on, you begin to realize something's not right. Like the first major hint is, as Maggie and Quentin are going to bed one night, Maggie makes a remark about Quentin's painting. And Quentin has no idea what she's talking about. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Dark Shadows, Quentin is, imagine Dorian Gray if he was a werewolf. Quentin is immortal. His soul is housed in an enchanted, or cursed, depending on how you look at it, painting. And and Quentin is also a werewolf. And in his place, the painting is what changes rather than him every full moon. And his bloodline is also cursed, that every firstborn son descended from him will also be cursed to be a werewolf. Anyway, the biggest problem with this story is that, as good as Catherine Lee Scott and David Selby are, they just have no chemistry together, which makes a little bit of sense, because Maggie and Quentin, that was a couple that was not set up in Dark Shadows at all. That was something the expanded universe only really picked up, and it doesn't. And I'm sure Catherine Lee Scott and David Selby have worked together loads of times, but you know, it's obvious that Maggie and Quentin's romance is something they haven't really done a ton of. In fact, prior to this, the only other time I can recall that they did anything with it was Return to Collinwood. But yeah, no, their lack of chemistry is really the biggest weakness of this story because everything else is so good. Their children, Emily and Ronan, are really good. The way, as I mentioned, the atmosphere is really good. And I think another weak point of this story, in regards to Maggie and Quentin's relationship, is that this story is very Maggie-centric. Quentin is mostly a background character. In the later stories, he will have a bigger role, but here, the focus is mainly on Maggie, and as she's trying to figure out what's going on. And the only link she has is this painting called The Girl at the Water's Edge. Excuse me, the painting is not the name of the title of this story. And because every time something changes, the water's edge changes as well. And the finale is really great. Is really great when Maggie finally confronts who's responsible for this. Her and David realize that everything that's been going on. Her and Quentin realize everything that's been going on has been an illusion, and they finally find the strength to overcome their foe. And especially in that climax, David Selby gives a great performance when he realizes that everything, even their children, aren't real. My only issue with the climax is that they try to set up a sort of he said, she said regarding the villain, and that's a twist. That's something that really requires build-up, something that this story doesn't set up. But overall, this is a really good start, and after the ordeal of this story, Quentin suggests they take a vacation in New York, which leads us to the second story, The Sand That Speaks His Name. And aside from their vacation, Maggie and Quentin actually has another purpose here. He has a safety deposit box in a bank with a few magical items in it, and wanting to start his life with Maggie sort of fresh, he wants to pass on these items to someone he knows will keep them safe. And I just want to say, I love stories like this regarding Quentin. Stories that explore his past. Not really his backstory or his origin story or anything, but Quentin is immortal, so he's obviously lived for some time. And we get a story every so often that explains what he's been doing in the intervening centuries since the present day. And a lot of those stories are really good. Like last year, Big Finish had a sale, and one of the sets they had was called Echoes from the Past, because a story in that written by Jerry Lacey is going to tie into this year's miniseries. And the Quentin story in that set was the best one, and the Quentin story was the best one of that set. I can't speak today. But yeah, as Maggie and Quentin are in New York, Quentin's past comes back to haunt him. And one of the things I like about Dark Shadows is it explores all these sort of literatures, classic horrors, various lores and mythology, witches, ghosts, vampires, and werewolves being the most common associated with Dark Shadows. But then we get other things every so often, like, say, a mummy. And in this story, The Sand That Speaks His Name, it's a golem. A sort of man-shaped creature from Jewish mythology carved out of clay. And, the golem has an enchanted piece of paper called a shem, which, when its sacred words are written on the shem and placed in its mouth, the golem comes to life and serves whoever awakened it. And, Quentin is very familiar with this golem because as he was in New York in the 1920s, he met a man whose name I'm now forgetting, and they traveled around together. They were friends for a bit until they got into a fight over who would control the golem, and the golem ended up killing Quentin's friend and entrapping his soul in its body. So the remainder of this story, after Quentin delivers the magical items he was there to get rid of, is them trying to stop the golem and free his friend's soul. It's a very straightforward story. There's nothing really special about it. I will say that its particular problem is that atmosphere that I was talking about from the first story. It's not here. This is a very action-heavy story. So it's less build-up, less tension, and just more high-octane, more energetic, if that makes sense. The only other thing of note, well, there's two more things of note here. This story is also formatted very uniquely for this set, because scene changes and interludes are done by sort of Maggie and Quentin cutting in and telling this story as if they're telling it to someone. And like I said, it feels out of place, but I personally, because none of the other stories do that, but I personally like it because it really helps improve the relationship between Maggie and Quentin. Because as I said, that was the weakest part of the first story, but as we go on through this set, their chemistry improves, and it's things like what they're doing here that helps it improve. The only other thing of note in this story is that we get sort of what we're building up to. As I mentioned, Quentin had a safety deposit box full of these magical items. And then he had a second one. Quentin's painting has been stolen. And that's where the story ends, really. Like I said, it's just a very straightforward story. It's very average. There's nothing really of note except how it sets up the greater arc of the series. And that leads us to The Hollow Winds That Beckon. After the ordeal in New York, Quentin and Maggie return to Collinwood. Something I want to note here, except for one character in the final story, none of the characters from the from the series or the previous audios show up in this. It's just Maggie and Quentin. They'll mention some of the other characters, but they don't show up. And, which, given that the focus is Maggie and Quentin, that's okay. And given that it's set so far after the series, that works too. Now that I think about it, it might be set around or even after Return to Collinwood, which takes place 30 years after the series ended. Anyway, this story, The Hollow Winds That Beckon, opens with Quentin surprising Maggie. It turns out Maggie's father had an old rowboat that he used to take her mother out on, and after restoring it, Quentin and Maggie decide to spend the day on the water, just relaxing, having fun, and again, this scene really helps improve Quentin and Maggie's relationship. By this point, you really start to believe them as a couple. But there is kind of a problem here. As this being a 4-story box set, the 4 stories are each an hour long. The setup to The Hollow Winds That Beckon is 30 minutes. So the entire first half of the story is just the setup. Quentin surprising Maggie with the boat, them going out on the water, and then it's only at the halfway point of the story that they get caught in a storm and stranded on an island. Which means then you have only 30 minutes of an hour-long story left to, set up the conflict and then have it resolved. And really the pacing is this story's biggest problem. Even though it's an hour long, it feels so much longer. It drags so much. It almost feels like this story was meant to be much shorter than an hour. I don't know how much shorter, but, like I said, just given that the initial setup is half an hour, and then you have this rushed conclusion, it feels like, oh shoot, this doesn't run to an hour. I need to pad this. Anyway, as I mentioned, Quentin and Maggie then get caught up in a storm and wind up stranded on an island, where they meet the island's mysterious resident, Jakelope. I think I'm saying that right. And she says that she was a muse from Greek mythology, so again, like the golem, like the other creatures in Dark Shadows, we're getting another aspect of another mythology, and that she's been stranded here for years, and that, people keep coming to her for inspiration, wanting to set up, wanting inspiration. She's a muse. There's no other way to explain that. One of those people was Maggie's father. Although it's interesting to note that I totally just blanked. Although it's interesting to note that Maggie's father, Sam Evans, did not want any of the muse's help. He did not want any inspiration. He came and he left. And then there's a problem here. Jackelope says that one of the people she inspired keeps coming back to the island as a ghost because people are drawn to muses. They're drawn to inspiration. And then there's a few scenes here that work, an illusion of Quentin sort of taunts Maggie and vice versa, an illusion of Maggie taunts Quentin, and they're good scenes, they're good dark scenes, but again, like The Sand That Speaks His Name, this story lacks that atmosphere that makes horror work so well. And when they realize that this ghost plaguing Jackelope might be at work, they decide to help her get rid of it. And then we get some really good twists here, and I don't expect you to go out and buy this box set, even though I do recommend it, but I will explain what the twist is. This ghost that's been haunting the island is Joe Haskell, Maggie's first husband. And Jackelope isn't a muse. She's a siren. She's been drawing people to the island, and sort of making these Faustian deals that in exchange for, what they want, their fame, their inspiration, what have you, she then curses them. And Joe has been, since his death, haunting the island as a ghost, trying to ward off people from going to her. And like I said, the climax, the way they beat Jackelope, again, it's all really rushed. Although I do like the ending of this story, where Maggie is able to let go of Joe, and similarly, as he fades away, Joe essentially gives their blessing to move on. And this story, again, with that greater arc of this set that I've mentioned, only really works in hindsight. Which brings us to the last story in this set, The Paper to the Flame by Alan Flanagan. And finally, after the last two stories were lacking, we get that really great atmosphere to this story. Again, that great, tense, uneasy atmosphere, as one of the plot lines Return to Collinwood established, and so is that at some point, Maggie became the head of Wincliffe Sanitarium, which we get a lot of here. And what's happened is that a lot of Maggie's patients have started standing up, pointing in a specific direction, and singing a sort of old nursery rhyme type song in unison. And real quick, too, I want to mention that here we get a cameo from one of the only other characters from previous iterations of Dark Shadows. Because here we get kind of a big role by Jackie Tate, who was Rhonda Tate's daughter, a character from the audios, who sort of played a major role in Bloodlust and Bloodline. And in the intervening years between Bloodline and Return to Collinwood in this set, Jackie sort of became Julia's protege, her apprentice, and now she's one of the leading doctors at Wincliffe. And Jackie's good in this story for what a limited role she has, but I'm sort of going off on that point too long. Anyway, Maggie and Quentin learn that a similar incident with other patients has been happening in other sanitariums, and across these three asylums, all of the patients are pointing in one spot, this little abandoned mining town, which Maggie and Quentin then drive off to figure out what's going on, because they realize this is supernaturally linked, and it might be linked to whoever stole Quentin's painting. And the mining town is an interesting set. This story explores a lot of Maggie's past. Maggie and Quentin, because this is, again, a very Maggie-centric story. Although Quentin still does have plenty to do, and he's not pushed to the background like he was in The Girl in the Water. Yes. So what happened? And the mining town setup is very interesting. It's been abandoned. It's a coal mine. I should start by saying that it's been abandoned because the vein caught fire. So basically, underneath the entire town, it's burning away to nothing, which is why it was abandoned. And here we get some great scenes with Maggie. Like, they play some old audio clips from the show of Sam Evans, which are used really well as a way of taunting Maggie. It turns out this town is where Maggie's parents met and married, which is why this confrontation is happening here. And then we find Quentin's painting, and we learn what's been going on. And I'm trying to figure out how to explain it, because I'm forgetting the antagonist's name. Hang on, I have the page open. Let me see if I can find it real quick. The man responsible for sort of the events of the last... Sort of responsible for the last few stories is named Lucian Cray. And he is taunting Maggie and Quentin because of how he perceives they both wronged him. So Quentin's painting, I'll start off with that. Over time, after it was painted, the person who painted it only ever painted landscapes after that. And then that painter, sorry, kind of an information overload at the moment, so I'm forgetting so much. That painter, at some point in his life, trained Sam Evans, Maggie's father. And at one point in this time, Sam met this man, Lucian Cray, and he painted a landscape over Quentin's painting with Lucian in it. The problem is, because of the enchanted nature of Quentin's painting, even when it was painted over, whoever was painted in it was also cursed to be immortal. And that is why Lucian is sort of so furious at both of them. Lucian and the other character, because that act is essentially a Thayer David character. He is furious at Quentin because of the cursed nature of his painting, and he's furious at Maggie because his father condemned him to be an immortal. And he has a really great monologue about what it was like, because he grew up during World War II, watching his friends die, continually being tortured. At one point he says, if you want to know what hell's like, I've already been there. And because, again, as I mentioned, this mining town is on fire, their confrontation eventually leads underground, and as everything's hot and burning, he says, feels just like home. It's a little theatrical, but it's not so much that it doesn't work, because it is still very effective. Regardless, Maggie and Quentin are able to help Lucian let go of his rage. They find a way to free him, and in the process, Quentin's painting is destroyed, rendering him mortal now. And, once again, a werewolf. And it does end on a very happy note. It kind of reminds me of how Bloodlust ended, now that I think about it. Just, Maggie looking towards a new, bright future. And so overall, the Maggie and Quentin, The Lover's Refrain, is a good set. I'd personally rank the stories from weakest to best. The Hollow Winds That Beckon, The Sands That Speak His Name, The Paper to the Flame, and The Girl in the Water. And when I listen to these stories for review, I always listen to it more than once. The first story for initial listening, and then the second time to make sure I have a good grasp on what's going on. The first time I listened to this story, I didn't care for it. I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it. I found it very average, very in the middle. I only really got it because I saw it was nominated for several awards. So it's like, I wonder how that is. And then the second time I heard it, in preparation for this review, my appreciation of it just jumped up so much. I came to really enjoy it much more the second time around. So much so that, yes, I would actually recommend this story. But those are just my thoughts on this set. Maggie and Quentin, The Lover's Refrain. Have you heard it? What are your thoughts? Remember to like, comment, subscribe, share the video around as it helps my channel grow. And then in the description box below, you'll find the link to my Ko-fi, where you can help support the channel, and you'll find the link to my Twitter, where you can follow me and get updates on the channel. This is the Sentinel, watching over Geekdom, and I'll see you guys next time.